I will do a short introduction to the panel discussion. I was asked to do that. And what you will see is, maybe you will remember it as a post-rock star presentation. I will do my best to be provocative and interesting. So, I just finished a big conference in Stockholm last Friday that was called City Moves, and it was the final part of a big research project where we were looking for trends for future cities. And I want to make a short summary of the findings of that research project, which I did at the School of Architecture. And what we found was, when we asked 400 experts on transportation and cities, what we found was that there are some things that these experts found certain. What we know is going to happen. We know that urbanization is going to continue. We know that ICT and technological development is going to continue. However, some things are uncertain in the future. The experts were not agreeing whether we will have a lot of energy, for example, in the future. How will that affect the development of the economy, economical growth? We also have an uncertainty of what kind of social values will we develop, what kind of social control. So from this trend analysis, we created 3 scenarios for future cities. The first one was the eco city, which is a possible future that we have little energy, low economic growth, but high social control. The techno city, it's not about music, it's a high energy society, but with high social control. And then we have the last one, as you can see, the free city, where we have a lot of energy, but there is less social control, so more market forces ruling the development of cities and traffic. And what we did was that we published these images and these scenarios in the biggest newspaper in Sweden, Dagens Nyheter, and we asked them to vote on these scenarios on the webpage. And we got 3,300 votes from the public, choosing. We asked them, what scenario would you prefer? And this was the results. So most people would prefer the eco or tech city, but very few people would prefer the free city, or maybe you could simply say the car city. We did an exercise at the conference asking also the participants of the conference, and the results were basically similar. This is evidence. And I think this says something, that there is some kind of agreement on what kind of future we'd like to want, or that we would like to see. At Spacescape, we have done quite a lot of studies on metropolitan regions in Sweden. And also, we did a big study of the housing market in Stockholm, and also we did that in Copenhagen. And what we saw in that study was that if we analyze the location variables of proximity to parks and services and transit, that could explain 90% of the differences in housing prices, both in Stockholm and in Copenhagen. So you can see, we could say we have evidence that actually the housing markets in these cities are driven by walkability. There are also new studies from the US that we see the same kind of trends there. I would also like to bring up the issue of walkability of an efficiency, from an efficiency perspective. That we know that denser compact cities decrease car use. And if streets are connected as well, we decrease the use of cars and traffic, and also increase foot traffic. As you may know, some of you, Spacescape did the bicycle strategy of Oslo, and we're so happy. We did it together with Oslo Kommune, and we're so happy that it has been now approved. One thing that we did was that we analyzed the bicycle network, and there is now a proposal to increase the bicycle network by 3 times in this bicycle strategy. We're really looking forward to see you make this happen, as Janette was saying. So I would also like to make a short comment on the concept of smart cities. It's been talked about a lot. In my view, a smart city, I would say, is a city that does what the city is supposed to do. And for example, if you ask Jane Jacobs or Howard Professor Edward Glaser, cities are basically all about social and human interaction. So a smart city is, of course, a city that connects people and make higher social interaction. But another very important character of a smart city is, of course, that they do it at a low cost. So I think we all can agree here that a smart city is right up in this corner, and that this is not a smart city, right? This is low interaction at a very high cost. And it doesn't matter if these vehicles are electric or biogas or self-driving. People will not, and the cities will not get any smarter anyway. So connecting to the other talks, I would say this is an example of a smart city. This is high social interaction at a low cost. And by saying this, I would like to introduce the panel to the stage. Yeah, so my first question will be to you, Mark. The report that Philipp has been working with, the new climate economy, and what we have heard from Philipp is that green growth is possible. You can increase economic growth and at the same time reduce climate emissions and so on. Could you just tell us how this is actually possible, and could you give some example that this is evidence of that this statement is true?
Well, I think it's certainly the case, not least because of the work Philipp and his colleagues have been doing, that a low carbon economy will be more successful than a high carbon economy in cities is generally accepted by the leaders of the world's leading cities as being true now, which was not the case even just a few years ago. Mm-hmm. So it's definitely part of the aspiration, it's part of the program of the world's major cities. I think the evidence that it can be achieved is sort of twofold. One, you can see it in a small number of cities around the world that have achieved that decoupling of economic growth from carbon emissions and other indicators of environmental pollution, which Philipp showed one of the graphs, which I forget which city you showed today.
Well, Copenhagen and Stockholm are the prime examples of exactly that.
But there are some others in the States, Portland, one or two others around the world that are moving in that direction. But the thing that makes me confident that it's possible is most of the things that those mayors need to do to achieve the environmental benefits are also things that, as we saw in Janette's presentation, things that are very popular with the public and deliver lots of social and economic benefits. So, as we know in most cities, driving better environmental performance requires a significant shift in transport usage out of private petrol, diesel-driven vehicles into public transport. That has historically been seen as a difficult, unpopular thing to do. What we now see is it's a better way of providing people with the mobility that they desire, but also has a whole series of other co-benefits in terms of reducing air pollution, which is a big problem now in the fastest growing cities in the world, particularly in China. Chinese cities, which I remember vividly talking to the the director of transport in Beijing a few years ago, who was proudly showing me a graph of the decline in cycling in the city and how they had recently, as 20 years ago, a quarter of all trips were made by bicycle. It was down to 5%, and they were aiming to get it down to 1% and get people into cars as a sign of progress. That's been completely changed now. The same guy I saw about 2 years ago now was showing me almost the opposite plan, which is how to get people back on their bikes. So I think that's the reason to feel positive, is that there's a synergy between the things that you need to do to achieve the low carbon growth and that which delivers a healthier city anyway.
But do you have, could you give some concrete examples? I mean, we have seen some from Janette and so that this has been done and this has changed.
Well, I mean, okay, so not to take the same ones that you've heard already, actually, London is an example of a city, perhaps not so well known, that has had, in its under the two mayors from 2000 onwards, has had extremely strong economic growth, other than the period of the global financial recession. But at the same time, has become one of the first major cities in the world to have an absolute decrease in the number of people driving cars and a huge increase in the use of both public transport and cycling, and maintaining very high levels of walking. So proof that that the economic success goes hand in hand with that policy. Yeah. But you're seeing the same thing now in what Johannesburg is doing with its huge bus rapid transit expansion, what the city of Rio is doing, which is a thoroughly thriving city, but where the mayor there has set a target of moving from under 20% of trips by public transport to over 60% in 6 years, using the huge investment that's coming into the city through the Olympics to have a massive expansion of the cycle network, but particularly bus rapid transit.
So the theme of today is actually that we want to connect money to this topic. And I would like to ask you, Philipp, that the transit seems to be a crucial issue. And I think that we have seen, for example, in Bergen, the bybana has really made the real estate market explode in Bergen on the transit locations. But there are issues about financing transit. I mean, how are the models that really work? Some say that transit is too expensive. What do you say about?
Okay, so the first thing is I mean, public transport, and particularly rail-based public transport, is expensive business. In cases where there's a sense that it's unaffordable, it's often related to particular sort of financing mechanisms that are in place and that do not, for example, account for a massive opportunity for value capture in the increase you have in land values. This is a big story which many cities are taking on now, following the successful example of Hong Kong in particular, where the public transport authority actually essentially operates as a real estate developer, and that's how they sort of recoup a lot of the upfront investments. What I mean by this recouping is you have a piece of land that at a certain moment is not accessible by public transport. You make sure that through the upgrading of public transport accessibility, the land value gain can be fed back into those guys that are paying. And in the past, we have often not done so, and the public has just subsidized the public transport system, and then you had private gains and, of course, sort of developers or indeed private landlords profiting from this massive investment. And that's why we're a bit in trouble in terms of coming.
But are there any risks of involving private money into this process?
So it doesn't have to be private money, right? So this can be even a publicly owned operation. The important thing is that the land, before it's sold to the market, becomes already accessible and you recapture. The Hong Kong example, yes, it's a stock-listed company that does so. And of course, you need to have the institutions in place that allow you for sort of due process. But if you have a certain institutional maturity, as you certainly have in Norway, I don't think that there's any worry about the capacities in that regard. I think this is a model you can certainly explore.
Yeah, so Janette...
I just want to add to that because I think that's a really important point. And I think that what we're seeing is cities have, in some senses, are having a hard time getting the funding that they need to build transit, right? In the United States, the federal government is actually cutting back on transit funding, and states don't have a lot of resources. So it's really cities that actually have to come to the table and bring those resources. And so one of the things that they're doing to follow up on Philipp's point is to create these tax increment financing districts. And so capturing the real estate appreciation from those transit investments. The number 7 line, which is the newest transit extension in New York City, is financed solely by capturing the property value increases from that land. And so there are very different ways of financing, and I think cities are going to have to be creative about looking for new strategies, new public-private partnerships, new innovative financing ideas, and looking at being much more entrepreneurial about bringing different players into the financing equation.
Yeah. Speaking of bad transit, I would like to bring up Copenhagen.
Ooh, you just couldn't wait to get it in.
Because everybody's talking about Copenhagen. And in fact, if you look at your figures, Philipp, Stockholm and Oslo has fewer car drivers than Copenhagen. Okay, so if we want to look at cities that have few car drivers, we should look at Stockholm and Oslo. Although we can be much better, of course. But my question to you, Janette, there are lots of modeling going on. And these numbers, as you have said, the share of car drivers and bikers and so on, how low can you think we can get in terms of the share of car drivers in the total?
Well, I think it depends on the city. It really depends on what the options are, right? I mean, you have, cities around the world that are now going to zero car, right? Different kind of districts that are happening, here. But I think that really, when you showed the example of Berlin and Atlanta, we can't wish people in Atlanta onto a transit system that doesn't exist. They're not going to get out of their cars unless they've got some options. So I think really the future of cities is about providing a kind of urban fabric that is rich with transportation options. And so I think that's why you're seeing, and Mark is seeing, these mayors around the world that are actually really investing on creating low-cost transportation mobility options and doing everything they can to do it, because getting people out of their cars is that economic development strategy. You save, $10,000 a year when you don't have to own, operate, and maintain a car. That's money that goes directly into your economy, directly. You can get mortgage, education, whatever. But that's a really important strategy that's not only financially strong, it's important to the environmental and physical health of our people.
But still we have a lot of sprawl. Even Oslo and Scandinavian European cities have a lot of sprawl, which is very hard to get some public transit. And I'm just also saying that we are building suburban shopping malls as well. We're still building the malls.
Yeah.
Well,
the strategies I think that you've seen that are working are when you can create a sort of urban growth boundary, where you can sort of ring where the development will be and set the table so that you are actually encouraging that development inside a particular ring. That's been very successful in Portland, Oregon, for example, where they've actually come up with a process for how it is that they direct that growth. And if they need to go beyond it, there's a process for going beyond it. But it's a very targeted growth management strategy, and because you have to have density to be able to get to that kind of outcome. I do think density is destiny when it comes to transport.
There's a quote. Density is destiny. So do you believe in urban growth boundaries, Philipp?
Yes, I do believe in urban growth boundaries. Now, I need to be careful and also qualify a bit why I do. I mean, the first thing is a lot of my colleagues, the economists, criticize those as second-best options of how you manage cities, and they lead to all sorts of market distortions. And for the stuff we are concerned about, for example, they lead to something which is called greenbelt jumping, where people reside beyond the greenbelt and then commute even longer to get into the city. Now, that latter thing has in particular to do with the shape of the greenbelt. And I think rather than having a belt, this is where Copenhagen is actually very good, have green wedges and allow for corridor development. Stockholm as well, yes.
Sorry.
No, absolutely. And I'm sure Oslo has had a similar approach. So have fingers that stick out into the region, develop those dense, avoids that problem. Now, and I think the other big advantage of producing something like a green belt, it's incredibly deeply sustainable policy in the sense of it often prevails over decades and generations. Once you have it in place, and the English example is probably the best situation, once it is in place, this is so difficult to change, and that in some ways is a good thing. If you go into the pricing story, that's going to change every year, or at least with the election cycle. We have seen it with congestion charging in London, where from one mayor to the next, a congestion charge extension was taken back. So the sort of celebrated pricing tool, which, again, economists would ideally see for everything we do, including how we design buildings, I think there is sort of a political risk that the life cycle of pricing tools is a much shorter one than we have it for big planning agreement where, populations get used to the idea that this place over there is green and it's going to be green when my kids are old as well, and that's a good thing.
So I think we know the evidence that density makes the job. However, there are researchers saying that transportation technologies would change much faster. You have the ICT, you have the Uber, they have the Lyft, everything. Mark, what do you think can happen with transportation technologies and, for example, self-driving cars? Will that change everything? How will it change everything?
Well, those things are already changing, particularly the Uber and the companies like it are radically changing the way people use private hire. But I think, actually, to take it back a stage, the thing that really comes out here for me is that the need for cities to have a plan, which is sort of at one level a relatively obvious thing to say. But if I tell you, if you look outside of this wonderful part of the world, in the city of Amman in Jordan, for example, that has just joined the C40, there is one member of staff in the urban planning team in that city. For that whole city of 4 million people, they have one person who's thinking about the long-term development of the city. And what's striking in the cities that have been most successful is they've had visionary leadership and systematic thought about the development of the city, which has then given some clarity. It's not been to kind of get rid of the role of the market in shaping the development of the city, but it's given clarity to the market about the boundaries in which things can develop. And that is in the context of some of the bigger issues that we have to confront here, because this is not just about, it would be nice to have a slightly better city tomorrow and therefore we should do these things rather than something else. This is, unfortunately, now an existential question in regards to an issue like climate change. We have to have lower carbon cities or we're not going to have much of a future. And in which case the critical thing for me is to start from the point of view of the city leadership, having some deep thought and a very clear plan for how the city needs to develop in a way which will allow people to have a high quality of life within 2 tons of carbon per person.
Yeah, but you're talking about leadership, but we also have to talk about money. Where do the money go, actually? So a question to you, Philipp, is actually how can you make... Janette, you showed us that less than 1% went to these alternative pedestrian bike infrastructure, and 250 million kronor will go to bicycle infrastructure in Stockholm. It's the same figure in Stockholm and in Oslo, but that's really very little money. How do you get the politicians to actually change their budgets?
I mean, I think, procedurally, that's not really an issue. Culturally, that's where the difficulty kicks in and the vested interests that are related to how these budgets are distributed. But I think you're spot on. I mean, we're not talking about massively increasing, certainly public expenditure. It's mainly a story about redistribution. And you can do, the big success stories in Bogota are about taking money away from building elevated highways and do schooling and then, yes, all the wonderful transport projects. Now, but how do you get this sort of almost into this cultural transformation from, reassigning budgets? I think this is something where, in some ways, the whole story also about putting costs so centrally and putting the economic argument at the center of what we're doing is in some ways building a bridge between sort of the political divides which exist between left and right politics. And the more we can break that down and actually create a consensus about some of the things we have been talking about, where all of a sudden we have libertarian mayors, even, not right-wing mayors, but right-leaning mayors buying into cycling, which actually they do, because it is about freedom and your own pleasure of the free city. And all of a sudden you have a Tory mayor in London who shifts a budget into cycling of £1 billion over 10 years. I think that is quite an important story about breaking down a certain cultural divide that so far existed around this green space, where it was perceived as something sort of lefty, woolly, and I think we are now entering a period where we're seeing sort of more business-oriented people very much buying the green story, and that is very good news.
Janette, can you comment
I think that's right. I mean, I think that we spent a lot of time on the data collection to be able to make the case of the before and the after, so that these kinds of projects and strategies aren't just crunchy, granola, green, freaky things to have. They're actually critical economic, development programs. And, the work that we're doing at Bloomberg Associates, where we work with mayors around the world, one of the things that's been really interesting for me is I do a lot of showing the before and after of our projects and show what can happen in a really short period of time. So most mayors are elected for a 4-year period of time. And there's not a lot of transportation projects that you can get done in a 4-year period of time. But if you can sort of show people, look at what you could do, just painting the city that you want to see, that then leads to that larger capital program, that's really compelling. And so they sort of look at it a little differently and then become much more involved and supportive, and that I think is helping to change that political dynamic and get the buy-in for the longer-term transit and biking and pedestrian infrastructure investments we need.
Yeah, but you can sit in a room with a lot of decision makers, and everyone says, yes, that sounds very nice, but we're just going to build this highway first. We have one highway in Stockholm. We have, you have your highways here in Oslo. Janette, do cities really need highways?
Well, I mean, like I've said before, I am not anti-car. I am pro-choice, and so the idea is that we need to make sure that we've got a balanced approach to our transportation network. And that's really what it's about. It's interesting to me, though, you take a look at there's a big highway, 470 and 405, the 405 in Los Angeles, and they spent billions of dollars to widen the 405, and the day that it opened, zero impact, right? They spent all this money, zero impact. It's induced demand. It's a pretty well-known concept, but you're not going to really be able to, widening roads is not necessarily the strategy going forward. It costs a lot of money, and so building in actually really strong fixed rail networks that can actually take that capacity and be able to build it, and because as soon as you build an additional lane on the road, you're actually that demand gets taken up instantaneously. So it's not necessarily that you're not building roads or taking care of the ones that you have. You just need to look at that asset differently and figure out ways to build in sustainable mobility, which to a large degree is in a big transit investment, which you are all making here, and again, improving the livability of the city with pedestrian and biking, walking infrastructure, which is just not that expensive.
So speaking of cars, I think we have an issue that we have to speak to all the people and businesses that are dependent on cars. And I would like to ask you, Philipp, then, what do you say to the car manufacturers, to the suburban retailers, to the people that build highways? What would you say to them?
Okay, so that's a tough one. Yeah. But there is an answer to that question, and it is about upscaling your business in a way that is currently not actually even thought about by a lot of the big car manufacturers. So let's just use the example of car manufacturers, where I think you could foresee a situation where we will hopefully dramatically reduce this idea of owning a vehicle and make our sort of even the smaller units of smaller vehicles, the cars as we have them today, part of a shared and public transport system. So what this allows you to do is actually, for some car manufacturers, particularly in the US and in Europe, potentially a quite interesting proposition. Because rather than producing a machine that's used for 5% of the time, it's a machine that's going to be used for 80% of the time. It's basically doing with the car business what we know from the aviation industry. Produce a piece of engineering which is incredibly sophisticated, very expensive, But because it's used and utilized so much, it actually provides mobility much cheaper and on the basis of more renewable energy. Now, why is this value proposition interesting? Because we do know that the margins in sort of car making, particularly sort of for the European and North American car makers, are being reduced. And their key expertise needs to be within the high-tech element of producing vehicles. So they have so far dealt a lot with issues of increasing the strength of the engine and making it more comfortable in a traditional way. And I think that there's probably far more openness within the industry to think about a revolution in the vehicle industry that gets rid of this difference between shared and public, and therefore upscales the actual technology that is used for those vehicles.
Actually, Ford Motor Company, the son, Bill Ford, is now doing a shared mobility program for Ford Motor Company. So I think that wave has crashed on our shores, and I think it's a good thing.
Mark, have you had an experience of talking to the car industry?
Yeah, well, quite a bit. I was involved in bringing in the congestion charge in London. So charging car drivers to come into the centre of London, which obviously was significantly opposed by the motor industry at the time. But what's interesting is, London is still a big market for the sale of cars, despite the fact that there are significantly fewer car movements in the centre of London during the day. But there were winners and losers. Toyota did brilliantly out of it because London became the key point of their marketing strategy in Britain for the sale of the Toyota Prius, because it didn't have to pay the congestion charge. And the vehicle fleet in London has changed. Manufacturers have responded to it and regulation at a European level. And I think that's the answer. The clever companies will change and react. And for many of the car manufacturers, I would suspect they'll go down the route that's being talked about, and the German manufacturers are going down in the conversations I have with them, which is to see themselves as providers of mobility in the future, not purely the manufacturers of cars. And that will probably be a much better deal for the consumer, because we'll get to drive the kind of vehicles we want at the times that we want it, rather than being stuck with 1 ton of metal that we take 5 years to pay for and it sits in the garage for most of the time without being used.
Yeah, there's one kind of funny evidence of that maybe things are changing in the US. I saw this stand-up comedian Louis C.K. who did he was describing how he changed his mind when he's driving a car, and he was really serious. Like when you're driving a car, you must be the most responsible and compassionate person you can be, because you're fucking driving a weapon. So this gets me thinking of street fights. Janette, you have a lot of, as you have been describing, been experiencing a lot of street fights, especially on bike lanes, for example. How do you solve a street fight?
Well, I do think that when you are doing change is difficult, and people, it takes them a while to sort of get comfortable with a different way of doing things, whether it's paying a charge for coming into the central business district, whether it's having a bike lane in front of their business, whether it's paying a little more at the meter to increase the turnover on parking spaces. All of these things are changing very traditional ways of doing business. And what we found was it was really critical to involve communities and particularly go door to door on all of our projects. And so anytime we had a project, whether it was a bike lane, a bus lane, a plaza, we talked to every single business person and every single residential building along the way. And a lot of times what we found, particularly with the business owners, was that a lot of times the parking regulations are as outdated as the street is. And so you can actually provide additional benefits to them, the different delivery windows, different parking opportunities, that changes the conversation a little bit. And so it feels like you're working with them instead of forcing something onto them. And so I think that went a long way to sort of start to massage it. But really, I don't think that the rhetoric went down until the polls came out. And again, that was when I think, to both of your points, you're starting to see when the public support is there, and people do see different ways of moving around, and they go to different cities. They want that in their city, and I think they're much further ahead than sometimes we give them credit for.
I think that's a great ending to this discussion, and I want to thank you so much for coming here and letting us hear your wise words for how to deal with the future and how to change the future. So, hand of applause to the panel.